Stringed instruments represent a fantastic opportunity in that no matter what we learn or where we learn it, we can cut and paste that same information somewhere else on the neck and basically reuse it in any key in a new situation. This is a fantastic way to reuse information that we already know. But do we really know it? Welcome back to the channel. My name's Chris. Today we will learn how to map intervals onto the fretboard. Now, intervals really represent everything we hear in music. All chords are made up of intervals. All scales are made up of intervals. Every melody is a string of intervals. Every guitar solo you've ever heard is intervals. So it would make sense that as musicians, no matter what instrument we play, we should have the responsibility to be able to find, use, and control these intervals. Well, I'm here to tell you, as guitar players, we fall woefully short on this task for the most part. We're going to fix that today. I'm going to briefly explain what intervals are, what their numbers are, why they're called that, what's going on. Then we're going to zoom in. I'm going to put these intervals onto the fretboard in a very, very simple way by attaching them to something that we already understand. Finally, I'm going to demonstrate how some of these intervals sound. Right? What is the nature of these intervals? What do they sound like? Why do we care? This video is brought to you by all the folks who support me on my Patreon page. If you're interested in getting a little bit deeper with me, maybe getting some more content, or you just like to show your support for the channel, my Patreon page is the way to go. It makes all of this possible. On my Patreon page, you can find tabs for every lesson on this channel, as well as live courses that I'm teaching. I'm also doing live Q&A. There's a lot going on there. And right now you can follow me for free there, and you can actually join for free as well for 7 days. So if you're interested, you really have nothing to lose. And if you do decide to support the channel, thanks very much in advance. Okay, intervals are our way of cataloging the difference and distance between notes. Now, there's a lot to unpack here in sort of the study of intervals, but getting a basic understanding of what these things are is actually very, very easy. We're going to use the major scale as our ruler. Not this kind of ruler, more like this kind of ruler, because it offers a beautiful scaffolding to sort of map intervals and see how they all connect and how they work together. So here's that major scale. Now, as you can see, all these numbers are lined up 1 through 7, right? And there's a root on the other end. That's an octave. These numbers serve two different purposes. They help us keep track of where we are in the scale, which note we're on, but they also stand in as names for the distances between those notes and that original root. In other words, from the root to the second note in a major scale is the interval of a second. When you go to that third note, you're actually traveling the distance of a third. That's the interval of a third. So as you can see, these numbers are really, really important. Now, the spaces in between these notes are also intervals, but they have different names, and depending on the context, we refer to them in different ways. Some are minor, some are sharp or flat, some are augmented or diminished. We don't have to track too much of that. I am going to explain that stuff when we zoom in, and speaking of which, let me stop rambling. Let's zoom in and let me show you what I'm talking about. Understanding everything there is to understand about intervals is not necessarily a very simple task, but mapping intervals to the guitar can be pretty easy, and I want to show you a methodology to do that. We're going to use our major scale. This is an A major scale. Root, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, root. This is our major scale, and as I said before, these numbers, they serve two different purposes. One is they sort of keep track of where we are in the scale. The root is the first note, the second note, the third note, the fourth note, the fifth note, etc. But they also act as a descriptor of the distance between that note and back to the root. In other words, here I am playing the fifth note in the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But the distance between here and here is called a fifth. It's called a perfect fifth. Now, what I want to do here is use this power chord. This is our A power chord, 5th fret on the E string, 7th fret on the A and D string. You may finger it like this. It's our classic power chord. This one's A. And I'm going to use this power chord to map these intervals back to this root here, back to this lower root. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to play this low root, and then I'm going to play each one of the intervals in the scale as a dyad. A dyad is two notes played at the same time. So getting started, I'm just going to play the two root notes. This is called an octave. That's the low root and that high root from our power chord. That next interval down is a seventh. That's a half step away. That's a major seventh. It's basically called major because we're pulling it from this major scale. There's our major seventh interval. From the major seventh down a whole step, we have our major sixth. It's a different sounding interval, right? The 6 down to the 5, I've got the 5 here in my power chord. There's a perfect fifth. This interval is called perfect because it's very stable sounding. From the 5, it's a whole step down to the perfect fourth. This one's called perfect as well because it's also stable. From that 4 down a half step is my major third. Again, called major because we're using that major scale. There's my major third. From the third down a whole step is my major second. And then we're back to the octave. Not that hard to see, especially if you're slightly or lightly familiar with the major scale. Octave, major 7. Major 6, perfect fifth, perfect fourth, major third, major second, octave. All right, now we're going to go back and do it again, but we're going to map all these gaps out too and stick names into these other intervals that we skipped over. So here's our octave. Down a half step is our major 7. Now there's a gap between the 7 and the 6. This is called the minor 7 interval. That's the distance of a minor 7th. Down a half step from there, we're back to our major 6th. Between that 6 and the 5, there's a gap there. If I just move this down a half step, that's called a minor 6th. Also referred to as a flat 6. Down a half step from there is back to our perfect fifth. Now as you can see, there's a whole step, a gap between that 5 and the 4. This note has a few different names. It's called the flat 5. You can also call this an augmented or sharp 4. And it's also called a tritone. We don't really need to clock this too much, just know that this note has a few different names. Let's call it the flat 5. Down a half step from there, we get back to our perfect fourth. Down a half step from there, we already have our major third. Here's that next gap. Between that 3 and the 2 is a gap. This is classically called the minor third. That note's up here too. You might recognize this from the bottom 2 notes of your pentatonic scale, minor pentatonic scale. Minor third. Down a half step from the minor third is our major second. And there's another gap. Our last gap is between the 2 and the root. That's called the minor second. That's a pretty horrible sounding interval. And then we're back to the octave. So I'm going to go down the whole row this time. Octave, major 7th, minor 7th, major 6, minor 6, perfect 5th, flat 5 or augmented 4th, perfect 4th, major 3rd, minor 3rd, major 2nd, minor 2nd, octave. So in doing this, we're really getting our ears used to what these intervals sound like. We're also really able to map them where they are on the fretboard without having to worry too much about where we are, how far away they are. We've just used that major scale and this power chord to map these intervals in a really simple way attached to something that's super familiar to us. In this way, we can now see whenever we get a new piece of information about numbers, flat this, sharp that, whatever. We can see it inside a power chord really easily using this method. Okay, so just by using this simple power chord, we've turned it into a scaffolding to map intervals around it. Now this is really important because anytime you come across any new information around music that features any numbers at all, they also reference these intervals. And so understanding how these intervals map to the fretboard, you'll be able to import information and learn new things very easily without depending on diagrams and patterns. I hope you found this information useful. I hope you found this lesson interesting. Above all other things, when this is on your lap, stay curious, ask questions, and you'll find the answers. I'll see you next time.